In today's video, I'm answering a question from subscriber and regular commenter Shane Flanagan. Shane has a what-if question regarding Anne Boleyn, or what Shane describes as counterfactual history. It's more of a discussion starter than something I can definitively answer, so please do share your views on this question. Here is what Shane wrote to me. One historical figure I think of often, and the possibilities, is Anne Boleyn and her fate had she not been executed. However cruel and shocking this execution was, we can see why Henry did it, how it played out in his favour and how it suited him. But what if Henry had had Anne banished or confined to a nunnery instead? We don't know her year of birth, but it's interesting to think of Anne possibly living to an older age, how and even whether she would have survived the reigns of Edward and Mary and lived to see her daughter Elizabeth become queen. Could she have escaped abroad during Mary's reign? Would Anne still being alive have affected Elizabeth's chances of becoming queen in some way? And what kind of relationship would Anne and Elizabeth have had? Would Elizabeth have welcomed her mother to court and given her a prominent role as Queen Mother? Would they have been close or clashed, often over personal matters and politics? Both women were very fiery, opinionated and headstrong. That's a great question, and I do love what-ifs. Let's first look at the facts. Anne Boleyn had been arrested on the 2nd of May 1536 after 3 years of being Henry VIII's Queen Consort. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London before being tried on the 15th of May for high treason. She was accused of committing adultery with Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton and Mark Smeaton, incest with her brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, and plotting with all 5 of these men to kill the king. She was found guilty and sentenced to death, to be burnt or beheaded at the king's pleasure. On the 16th of May, at her daily dinner with Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower of London, Anne was suddenly hopeful that her life would be spared. This was following a visit from her good friend and confessor Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop had been sent not only to hear Anne's confession, but also to obtain her agreement to the annulment of her marriage to the king. Kingston was sending Thomas Cromwell daily reports on the prisoners, and so reported what Anne said to him at dinner. Unfortunately, Kingston's letters were damaged in the Ashburnham House fire of 1731, where the Cotton collection of manuscripts was housed. And this letter has a word that is hard to make out. Some have transcribed it as Anvers, the French name for Antwerp, and others as a nunnery or a nunnery. Kingston writes, "This day at dinner the Queen said that she should go to Anvers, or a nunnery, and is in hope of life." Whether she said Antwerp or a nunnery, Anne appears to have believed that she might be allowed to go into exile instead of being executed. This begs the question, had Anne been offered mercy in return for her agreeing to the annulment? Something surely must have been said for her to suddenly think that she was being exiled. Sadly, Anne's hopes were to be dashed. The 5 men were executed on the 17th of May, and Anne was executed, thankfully by beheading rather than being burnt alive, on the 19th of May. But what if Anne had been allowed to go into exile? Well, personally, I can't believe it was ever a realistic option. I believe 100% that Henry wanted Anne gone permanently. As I've often said before, Catherine of Aragon had been banished from court, but still managed to be a thorn in the king's side. She refused to recognise her demotion from Queen to Dowager Princess of Wales and continued calling herself Queen. And many important people at court sided with her and her daughter Mary, creating factions vying for power at the Tudor court. She also made Henry's plans for foreign policy difficult, as her nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, Anne Boleyn may not have been related to the Holy Roman Emperor, but Henry VIII needed his marriage to Jane Seymour to be 100% valid and recognised by all. If Anne was still around, then there'd be some who viewed him still married to her. Catherine was finally gone, and now he needed Anne gone too. He needed a fresh start, A blank page. Just one wife. But what if? That's the question. What if Henry had suddenly thought about his youngest daughter and felt that he couldn't kill her mother, that was a step too far? What if he just couldn't bring himself to sign the death warrant and decided that Anne could just be banished? What could have happened? Well, I decided to ask ChatGPT. What would artificial intelligence think about this question? Here is what it answered. That's an interesting hypothetical scenario. If Anne Boleyn had been sent to a convent or into exile instead of being executed, it would have drastically changed the course of history. Firstly, her daughter Elizabeth I might not have become the influential monarch that she was. Anne's execution played a role in shaping Elizabeth's resilience and political acumen. If Anne had been sent to a convent, she might have lived out her life in seclusion, away from the political turmoil. However, her presence could still have been a source of intrigue and potential danger for the ruling powers of the time. If sent into exile, Anne might have become a political pawn or even tried to form alliances against Henry VIII. The Tudor succession would have been different, potentially affecting the stability of the monarchy. The religious landscape of England might also have taken a different turn without Elizabeth I's reign. It's fascinating to think about the ripple effects of such historical what-ifs. I'm quite impressed with that, as it makes some valid points. Of course, it's impossible to know how Elizabeth was affected by knowing that her father had her mother executed and by losing her mother in such a brutal way. But I suspect that Elizabeth's resilience came from the scary times in her life. Thomas Seymour preying on her and being interrogated about him, and then being imprisoned in her half-sister's reign and believing that she could well be executed. Or perhaps Elizabeth was just a strong and determined person. She may have become just as determined had her mother lived. However, I do agree with the point that Anne's presence, even far from the English royal court, may have become a source of intrigue and potential danger. Anne was an evangelical and appears to have been heading for what we now call Protestantism. So she may well have become a focus for like-minded people, as Catherine did for Catholics, if Anne was able to remain in England. It would have been more difficult if she'd gone to Antwerp, though. Would she have returned from exile in Edward's reign? Well, I don't think so. I think Edward believed that she'd plotted against his father, so she wouldn't have been welcome. I can imagine Anne being a focal point for Protestant exiles in Mary I's reign, though, and perhaps we would have seen plots against Mary to remove her from the throne and replace her with Elizabeth. Those who'd supported Lady Jane Grey and survived may well have looked to Anne and a community of Protestants that surely would have built up around her to support a plot against Mary. I think Anne would have survived Mary's reign if she was abroad, but I think she would have been in danger had she remained in England and been suspected of any moves against the Queen. Would Mary have executed her half-sister's mother? Yes, I think so. She executed her relative, Lady Jane Grey, after all. Would Anne have survived to see her daughter become Queen? Well, Anne would only have been in her 50s when Elizabeth became Queen, but then her sister died in her early 40s. It's impossible to know, but if she'd been in exile in Antwerp and safe from any retribution for plots, etc., then it's perfectly plausible that she could have survived and left exile with the other Protestant exiles to return to England after Elizabeth's succession. How proud Anne would have been, and I expect she would have attended on her daughter at her coronation and would have been a sounding board for her daughter, a useful counsellor. Would they have clashed with them both being strong personalities and having quick tempers? Perhaps, but as with Anne's relationship with Henry VIII, I think any argument would quickly blow over. I can see Anne being another Lady Margaret Beaufort, can't you? She would have had a high status at court and would have relished being back at court, I'm sure. Her experience as Queen Consort would have been very helpful to the young Elizabeth. One thing Shane didn't ask is whether Anne could have remarried. If she'd gone into exile abroad, then I can see her remarrying. Would it have to have been authorised by the English monarch? Possibly. Or perhaps as a widow she could have gone her own way. Perhaps she could have secretly married. I know there have been alternative history novels written about Anne Boleyn surviving her execution, but I haven't come across one having her go to a convent or into exile abroad. We need someone to write one. It would be wonderful to explore this what if in fiction. Well, you've heard ChatGPT's thoughts on this and my thoughts too. But what do you think? I'm sure there are factors I haven't explored here, so please feel free to share your views. Thank you for listening. See you soon.